Due to a fire, our house burned down where me and my sister were rushed to ICU. That's when my parents stormed in the room and started asking, "Where's my sister?" Once they saw her, they started crying. "Who did this to you, honey?" I was laying next to them, and when I said, "Dad," my parents shut me down. "We didn't ask you, we are speaking to our daughter." When my mother saw we were both on life support, she said to me, "We have to pull the plug, we can't afford 2 kids in ICU." My sister smirked and said, "It's all her fault, make sure she doesn't wake up." My father placed his hand on my mouth and I unplugged my machine. Uncle added, "Some children just cost more than they're worth." When I woke up, I made sure they never sleep again. The smell of smoke still clings to my hair sometimes, even though it's been 3 years. Phantom scents are cruel that way, dragging you back to moments you've spent every waking hour trying to forget. But I don't want to forget anymore. What happened in that hospital room changed everything, and I need you to understand why I did what I did. My name is Rebecca Torres, and I'm 26 now. Back then, I was 23, working as a junior accountant at a small firm in Columbus, Ohio, while living at home to save money. My older sister Madison was 25, unemployed for the 3rd consecutive year, and still treated like royalty by our parents, Richard and Diane Torres. Madison had always been the golden child, prettier, more charming, better at manipulating every situation to her advantage. Growing up, I learned early that love in our household wasn't distributed equally. Madison got the larger bedroom, the newer clothes, the college fund that somehow evaporated before I graduated high school. Our parents explained it away with excuses that became mantras. Madison needed more support, Madison was sensitive, Madison had such potential. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs through college, graduated with honors, and received a card with $20 inside as congratulations. The fire started on a Tuesday night in March. I'd been in my room, reviewing tax documents for a client presentation, when I smelled something burning. Our house was old, built in 1987, with wiring that probably should have been replaced a decade ago. I later learned the fire started in the basement, in a tangle of extension cords near the water heater. Madison had been doing laundry, left her phone charging on top of the dryer, and went upstairs to watch television. I remember running into the hallway and seeing orange light flickering from downstairs. The smoke alarms were screaming, filling the house with their shrill warnings. I ran to Madison's room first, ironic, considering what would happen later, and found her standing frozen by her window, staring at her reflection in the glass. "We have to go," I shouted, grabbing her arm. She yanked away from me. "My laptop. My photos." "There's no time." But Madison darted back toward her desk. The smoke was getting thicker, making my eyes stream and my throat close. I pulled my shirt over my nose and went after her. She was fumbling with cords, trying to disconnect her computer while flames began eating through the floor below us. I could feel the heat through my shoes. I grabbed her around the waist and physically dragged her toward the stairs. She fought me, scratching at my arms, screaming about her things. We made it halfway down before a section of the staircase collapsed. I remember falling, the sensation of weightlessness, then the impact that knocked the air from my lungs. Pain exploded through my left side. Madison landed on top of me. The smoke was so thick I couldn't see anything. I pushed her off and tried to crawl toward where I thought the door should be. My hand touched something hot and I jerked back. The ceiling above us groaned. I grabbed what I thought was Madison's jacket and pulled with everything I had. The firefighters found us in the entryway. I was unconscious by then. Madison was still breathing but barely. We both suffered severe smoke inhalation and burns. I had 3 broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, and 2nd-degree burns across my back and left arm. Madison had burns on her legs and arms, smoke damage to her lungs, and a concussion from the fall. They transported us to Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. I woke up briefly in the ambulance, saw the oxygen mask over my face, felt the strange disconnection of heavy pain medication, then slipped back under. The next time I opened my eyes, I was in the ICU, hooked up to more machines than I could count. Everything hurt. My throat felt like I'd swallowed broken glass. A nurse noticed I was awake and came over. "Take it easy, honey. You're in the hospital. You're safe now." I tried to speak but couldn't manage more than a croak. "Your family's on their way," she said, adjusting something on one of the machines. "You're very lucky to be alive." I learned later that Madison was in the bed next to mine, separated by a curtain. We were both on ventilators, both critical but stable. The doctors said the next 48 hours would determine everything. My parents arrived 4 hours after I first woke up. I heard them before I saw them. My mother's voice carried down the hallway, high and panicked. "Where is she? Where's my baby?" The curtain between Madison's bed and mine was partially open. I could see the nurses directing my parents to Madison's side. My father rushed past my bed without even glancing at me. My mother followed, her face streaked with tears. "Madison," she cried, gripping the bed rail. "Oh God, Madison, can you hear me?" I watched them hover over my sister. Madison's eyes fluttered open. Even through the oxygen mask, I could see her trying to smile at them. My mother kissed her forehead, careful of the bandages. My father held her hand, his shoulders shaking. "Dad," I managed to say, my voice barely audible through my own oxygen mask. Neither of them turned. "We're here, sweetheart," my mother said to Madison. "We're right here. You're going to be okay." "Dad," I tried again, louder this time despite the pain. "Mom." My father's head whipped around, and for a second, I thought he'd come to me. Instead, he held up one hand, palm out like a stop sign. "We didn't ask you," he said, his voice cold. "We are speaking to our daughter." The words hit harder than any physical injury. I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. My mother didn't even look in my direction. She was stroking Madison's hair, murmuring reassurances. A doctor entered, a tired-looking woman in her 50s named Dr. Patricia Chen. She introduced herself and began explaining the situation. Both Madison and I were in serious condition. The smoke inhalation had damaged our lungs. We both needed extensive treatment, weeks in the ICU, possibly longer. The burns would require surgery and skin grafts. The cost would be substantial. My mother went pale. "How much are we talking about?" Dr. Chen named a figure that made my father sink into a chair. "Insurance will cover a significant portion, but with 2 patients, the out-of-pocket expenses will still be considerable." My parents exchanged a look I'd seen before, the silent communication of people who've been married for 30 years. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "We can't afford this," my mother said quietly, but I heard every word. "Not for both of them." Dr. Chen blinked. "I'm sorry? Is there any way to prioritize?" My father asked. "Focus resources on one patient?" The doctor's expression hardened. "Mr. Torres, both your daughters need immediate, intensive care. This isn't a matter of choosing." My mother turned to look at me for the first time since entering the room. Her eyes swept over me with something that looked like calculation, like she was measuring my worth in dollars and cents. Then she looked back at Madison, and her face softened with the love I'd spent my entire life craving. "We have to pull the plug," she said, her gaze returning to me. "We can't afford 2 kids in ICU." The room seemed to tilt. I tried to sit up, but the pain and the tubes held me down. "Mom, no." Madison's eyes opened wider. Even in her condition, I saw the glint of satisfaction. She reached up weakly and pulled her oxygen mask to the side. "It's all her fault," she whispered, her voice raspy but clear enough. "Make sure she doesn't wake up." My mother's hand covered Madison's, gently repositioning the mask. "Save your strength, baby." "Did you hear what she said?" I couldn't believe this was happening. "Madison, tell them the truth." My sister's eyes locked with mine, and she smiled. Even through the oxygen mask, I saw it clearly. That same smug smile she'd given me 1,000 times growing up whenever she'd successfully blamed me for something she did, whenever she'd convinced our parents I was the problem. My father stood and walked to my bedside. I felt a surge of hope. Maybe he'd come to his senses, maybe he'd remember us as his daughter too. He reached down, and for a moment, I thought he might take my hand. Instead, he leaned close, his face inches from mine, and whispered, "This will be easier on everyone." His hand reached for the ventilator cord. I watched in horror as he gripped it, his fingers wrapping around the connection. My mother stood behind him, her arms crossed, watching. Not stopping him. Not protesting. I tried to move, to reach for the call button, but the pain and weakness kept me pinned to the bed. The ICU door opened again. My Uncle Raymond walked in, my father's older brother. He took in the scene with barely a glance at me. "How bad is it?" Raymond asked. "We're handling it," my father said, his hands still on the ventilator connection. Raymond walked closer, looked down at me with the same dismissive expression I'd seen on my father's face. Some children just cost more than they're worth. That's when my father unplugged the ventilator. The alarm started immediately, a cacophony of urgent beeping. Without the ventilator, my damaged lungs couldn't pull in enough air on their own. The oxygen saturation monitor began dropping rapidly. The room started to darken around the edges, my vision tunneling. The ICU nurse who'd been at the monitoring station saw the alarms on her screen and came running. She was there within seconds. Nurses rushed in. Someone shouted. I felt my father yanked backward, away from the bed. Dr. Chen's face appeared above me, furious and determined. Someone was pushing my father back, physically restraining him. The ventilator plugged back in. Air flooded back into my lungs, painful and precious. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Dr. Chen shouted at my father. "Security. Get them out of here now." The next few minutes were chaos. My parents were forcibly removed from the ICU, protesting the entire way. Raymond left with them. I lay there, shaking, my heart rate sending all the monitors into a frenzy. A nurse stayed by my side, holding my hand, telling me I was safe now. But I wasn't safe. I understood that with perfect clarity. My own parents had just tried to kill me. My sister had encouraged it. My uncle had endorsed it. And given the chance, they would try again. I spent the next 6 weeks in the hospital. Dr. Chen became my advocate, documenting everything that had happened and ensuring my parents were barred from the ICU. A social worker named Janet Harris was assigned to my case. She helped me file a police report and connected me with resources for adult abuse victims. My parents tried to spin the story. They claimed they'd been hysterical with grief, that they hadn't known what they were doing, that it was all a misunderstanding. They hired a lawyer who painted me as vindictive and unstable, someone who was exploiting a tragic accident to attack her grieving family. But hospital security footage doesn't lie. The cameras captured everything: my father reaching for the ventilator, his deliberate action of unplugging it, the casual cruelty in his expression. The footage also caught audio of Madison's words, "It's all her fault, make sure she doesn't wake up." Madison recovered faster than I did. She was transferred out of the ICU after 3 weeks. My parents took her home to the temporary apartment they'd rented after the fire destroyed our house. They hired the best lawyers, the best doctors for Madison. For me, they did nothing. The district attorney, a sharp woman named Amanda Reeves, took interest in my case. She saw the footage, heard my testimony, and decided to prosecute. The charges were serious: attempted murder for my father, conspiracy for my mother and Madison, and accomplice to attempted murder for Uncle Raymond. The preliminary hearing happened while I was still recovering. I watched via video link from my hospital room. Seeing my family on screen, dressed in their Sunday best, playing the role of devastated parents, made me physically sick. Madison sat between them, wearing a neck brace she didn't need, milking sympathy from everyone in the courtroom. Their lawyer argued that the stress of nearly losing both daughters had caused a temporary psychotic break in my parents. He painted them as loving, devoted parents who'd made a single terrible mistake in a moment of unimaginable trauma. He suggested I was a troubled young woman who'd always been jealous of my sister, who was now using this tragedy to destroy my family. But Amanda Reeves was better. She presented the hospital footage, the testimonies of Dr. Chen and the ICU nurses, and the documented history of financial favoritism toward Madison. She brought in my bank statements showing I'd been paying rent to my parents while Madison lived free. She found my college loan documents and compared them to the empty education fund. She even obtained records from the fire marshal's investigation, which concluded the fire had been accidental, caused by overloaded extension cords and old wiring. There was no evidence Madison had deliberately started it, but the report noted she'd been warned multiple times about the electrical hazards in the basement, and had ignored those warnings. The judge denied bail. All 4 of them would await trial in custody. I was released from the hospital after 2 months. The physical recovery was brutal: physical therapy for my ribs and collarbone, painful treatments for the burns, breathing exercises to rebuild my lung capacity. But the psychological damage cut deeper than any burn. Janet helped me find a small apartment in Dublin, a suburb outside Columbus. My employer had kept my position open, and I returned to work part-time. People at the office treated me differently now, with a mixture of pity and fascination. I was the girl whose parents tried to kill her. I was infamous. The trial began 8 months after the fire. The prosecution had built a solid case, but my family's defense team was expensive and aggressive. They attacked my character, dredging up every teenage mistake, every bad grade, every argument I'd ever had with my parents. They painted me as a burden, a disappointment, a daughter who'd driven her loving parents to desperation. During the weeks leading up to the trial, I discovered something that changed everything. While going through documents for the civil lawsuit, my attorney found life insurance policies my parents had taken out on both Madison and me. Mine was worth $500,000. Madison's was worth $50,000. The policies had been purchased 6 months before the fire. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Gonzalez, highlighted this detail with her pen. "This establishes financial motive," she said, sliding the documents across her desk to me. "Your parents stood to gain significantly from your death." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't just chosen Madison over me in a moment of panic. They'd been planning something. Maybe not the exact scenario that unfolded, but something. The insurance policy was proof that I'd been assigned a value, and in their minds, I was worth more dead than alive. Patricia contacted Amanda Reeves immediately. The insurance policies became a central piece of evidence in the criminal trial. The defense tried to explain it away. They claimed the differing amounts were because I had a higher risk job, because I drove more frequently, because of actuarial tables and risk assessments. But the jury saw through it. Combined with the decades of documented favoritism, the insurance policies painted a damning picture. I spent hours in Patricia's office, combing through every financial document from my parents' lives. We found more discrepancies. Madison had been added to their bank accounts as a joint owner 2 years prior. I had not. They will left everything to Madison, with me receiving only personal items of sentimental value, a clause so vague it essentially meant nothing. They'd refinanced the house and taken out a home equity loan, spending the money on Madison's failed business ventures, her car, her credit card debt. Every discovery felt like another knife in my back. But I documented everything? I photographed every statement, every contract, every piece of evidence that showed how little I'd mattered to them. Patricia organized it all into binders, evidence of a lifetime of being treated as less than. Madison testified wearing designer clothes our mother must have bought before her arrest. She cried on the stand, claiming she didn't remember saying those words, that the smoke damage and medication had confused her, that she loved me and would never want me hurt. The jury watched her with sympathy. Then the prosecution played the hospital footage with audio enhancement. Madison's voice came through crystal clear. "It's all her fault, make sure she doesn't wake up." The smile on her face was unmistakable. The jury's sympathy evaporated. My father's lawyer tried to argue that disconnecting the ventilator was an attempted murder because medical staff immediately intervened. Amanda Reeves countered by walking the jury through what would have happened if the nurses had been 30 seconds slower. She brought in a pulmonologist who testified that with my father's hand restricting airflow and the ventilator unplugged, I would have suffered fatal hypoxia within minutes. Uncle Raymond's lawyer claimed he'd only made an insensitive comment, nothing more. But the footage showed him standing by, watching my father try to kill me, doing nothing to intervene. The prosecution argued that his words had encouraged and endorsed the act, making him an accomplice. The verdict came back after 3 days of deliberation. My father was found guilty of attempted murder. My mother was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Madison was convicted of conspiracy and solicitation to commit murder. Uncle Raymond was found guilty as an accomplice to attempted murder. The sentencing hearing happened 2 weeks later. I gave a victim impact statement. Standing in that courtroom, looking at the 4 people who were supposed to protect me, I finally said everything I'd kept inside for 23 years. I told them about every birthday where Madison got lavish parties while I got a cake from the grocery store. I described working 40 hours a week in high school while Madison got an allowance for doing nothing. I recounted every time I'd brought home an achievement and been met with indifference, while Madison's smallest accomplishments were celebrated like miracles. "You taught me I was worthless," I said, looking directly at my parents. "You taught me that love was conditional, that I had to earn the basic respect you gave Madison freely. And when you had to choose between us, you didn't even hesitate. You chose her, and you tried to erase me." My mother cried throughout my statement. My father stared at the table. Madison glared at me with pure hatred. Uncle Raymond looked bored. The judge sentenced my father to 15 years in prison. My mother received 12 years. Madison got 8 years due to her age and lesser role. Uncle Raymond received 5 years. The sentences felt simultaneously too harsh and not harsh enough. After the trial, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I went to therapy 3 times a week, working through the trauma with a psychologist named Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She helped me understand that what happened wasn't about me, it was about my parents' twisted values and Madison's narcissism. The months following the sentencing were strange. I'd expected to feel victorious, satisfied, at peace. Instead, I felt hollow. Winning in court hadn't erased the years of being invisible in my own family. The guilty verdicts hadn't healed the wound of knowing my parents would have let me die without hesitation. Dr. Mitchell encouraged me to write letters I'd never send, to express everything I'd never been allowed to say. I filled notebooks with rage, grief, and questions that would never be answered. Why wasn't I enough? What had I done to deserve being treated as disposable? How could a mother look at her child and decide she wasn't worth saving? I started having nightmares where I was back in that hospital bed, watching my father's hand reach for the ventilator cord over and over. I'd wake up gasping, my heart pounding, convinced I was suffocating. My apartment became a prison of my own anxiety. I was afraid to sleep, afraid to be vulnerable, afraid to trust that I was actually safe. Dr. Mitchell suggested EMDR therapy for the PTSD. The sessions were brutal, forcing me to relive the trauma while doing bilateral stimulation exercises. But slowly, incrementally, the nightmares became less frequent. The panic attacks diminished. I began to feel like I was reclaiming my own mind from the people who'd tried to destroy me. Around this time, I reconnected with my childhood best friend, Zoe Richardson. We'd grown apart during high school when my parents had forbidden me from certain social activities while allowing Madison complete freedom. Zoe reached out after seeing news coverage of the trial. We met for coffee, and she admitted something that floored me. "Your mom called my mom when we were 16, Zoe said, stirring her latte. She told her I was a bad influence on you, that I was leading you down the wrong path. My mom believed her. That's why our sleepovers suddenly stopped. Another manipulation, another way my parents had isolated me while giving Madison everything. Zoe and I had both believed it was just teenage drift, the natural way friendships sometimes fade. We'd never known it was orchestrated. Madison told everyone at school you were jealous of her, Zoe continued. She said you'd always been competitive, that you couldn't stand seeing her happy. A lot of people believed it because, well, your parents seemed to agree. The revelation made me physically ill. My entire adolescence had been shaped by lies Madison told and my parents endorsed. I'd been lonely, isolated, convinced something was wrong with me. All of it had been by design. Zoe became part of my support system, along with Dr. Mitchell and Janet, the social worker who'd stayed involved even after my case officially closed. They formed a buffer between me and the darkness that sometimes threatened to pull me under. They reminded me I was worthy of care, that what happened wasn't my fault, that I deserved to heal. I also filed a civil lawsuit for attempted murder, emotional distress, and compensation for medical expenses my insurance hadn't covered. My parents had owned the house outright, or had, before it burned down. The insurance payout was substantial. They'd also had retirement accounts, savings, and other assets. The civil trial was faster than the criminal one. With criminal convictions already on record, establishing liability was straightforward. The jury awarded me $2.3 million in damages. My parents' assets were liquidated to pay the judgment. Everything they'd spent their lives building went to me, the daughter they tried to discard. My parents had some savings and retirement accounts before their arrest, which their original criminal defense attorney had accessed with power of attorney paperwork they'd signed. That money paid for their initial legal representation. Once those funds were exhausted during the trial, they were assigned public defenders for appeals. Madison's legal costs came from those same pre-arrest funds. Our mother had moved money around frantically in the days after the fire, before the criminal charges were filed. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a basic defense attorney. The designer clothes Madison wore to court were actually items she'd owned before the fire, which our parents' lawyer had retrieved from a storage unit where some salvaged belongings had been kept. Madison's conviction meant she couldn't inherit anything from our parents. Every penny went to me. It felt like cosmic justice. But money didn't satisfy the rage that still burned in my chest. The rage that woke me up at night, that made me relive that hospital room over and over. They tried to kill me, and 8 to 15 years in prison didn't feel like enough. I wanted them to suffer the way I'd suffered. I wanted them to feel helpless and betrayed and disposable. I started with Uncle Raymond, since he'd be released first with good behavior in as little as 3 years. I hired a private investigator named Tom Brennan to dig into his life. Tom was thorough and discreet. Within 3 months, he discovered something interesting. Uncle Raymond's lifestyle far exceeded his reported income. He drove a luxury car, owned a vacation property in Florida, and frequently took expensive trips, all on a construction supervisor's salary. Tom couldn't access company financial records directly, but he didn't need to. He documented everything: the properties, the vehicles, the travel, the discrepancy between Raymond's tax returns and his obvious wealth. He found disgruntled former co-workers who hinted at kickback schemes. He discovered vendors who'd been asked to inflate invoices. He built a circumstantial case that pointed clearly toward financial crimes. I compiled all the evidence Tom found: bank records showing suspicious deposits, photographs of assets that didn't match his income, testimony from witnesses about possible kickback arrangements, and sent it anonymously to the construction company's board of directors, the IRS, and the FBI. I included detailed notes about where investigators should look, what questions to ask, and which employees might cooperate. The investigation moved quickly once authorities had direction. They subpoenaed records, interviewed employees, and uncovered the embezzlement scheme Uncle Raymond had been running for years. He'd been taking kickbacks from vendors, approving inflated invoices, and skimming money through shell companies. By the time Uncle Raymond was released from prison for his role in my attempted murder, he was immediately arrested on federal fraud charges. The trial for his financial crimes concluded with a guilty verdict on 17 counts. The judge sentenced him to 12 additional years in federal prison. Uncle Raymond would be nearly 70 before he saw freedom again. My mother was next. In prison, she'd been writing letters to Madison, to her friends, to anyone who would listen. She portrayed herself as a victim, a devoted mother who'd made one mistake and was being persecuted by her ungrateful daughter. Some people believed her. She built a small support network on the outside, people who sent her money, visited her, and campaigned for her early release. I created fake social media profiles and infiltrated those support groups. I posed as a sympathetic friend, someone who believed in my mother's redemption. Over months, I gained the trust of these people. Then I began slowly, carefully, revealing inconsistencies in my mother's story. I shared court documents, hospital footage, testimony transcripts, all public record, all completely legal. I watched as her support network began to crumble. People who'd sent her commissary money stopped. Visitors became less frequent. The woman organizing a clemency petition quietly shut down her website. My mother was left isolated, with nothing but the consequences of her actions for company. Inside prison, I arranged for her to receive special attention from the other inmates. I didn't have to orchestrate violence, I would never do that. But prisoners have their own moral code, and crimes against children, even adult children, are viewed with particular disgust. I hired someone to write letters to inmates in my mother's facility, letters that appeared to come from a prison reform advocacy group. These letters included details about various inmates' cases, including my mother's. The information was all public record, court transcripts, news articles, victim impact statements. I just made sure it circulated widely within the prison walls. Her letters from prison, which I received through my lawyer, grew increasingly desperate. She was being ostracized, harassed, and threatened. She begged me to help her, to arrange a transfer, to do something. I sent one letter back, a single sentence: "You taught me that some children just cost more than they're worth." My father proved more difficult. He kept to himself in prison, avoided trouble, and maintained his innocence despite the conviction. He gave no interviews, made no statements, and showed no remorse. His parole hearing would be in 7 years, and I couldn't let him walk out early. I needed him to violate prison rules in a way that would add time to his sentence or at minimum destroy any chance of parole. I researched prison contraband policies extensively. Then I sent a series of packages to various inmates, packages that appeared to come from a non-existent prisoner advocacy group. Inside were letters of encouragement and small amounts of cash hidden in book bindings, enough to get the recipients in trouble, but not enough to seriously harm anyone. I anonymously tipped off prison officials about the packages. The resulting investigation swept through the facility. Multiple prisoners were caught with contraband, and officials traced the packages back to a P.O. box I'd rented using a shell corporation. The trail went cold there, but the paranoia in the prison was thick. In that atmosphere of suspicion, I sent one more package, this one directly to my father, appearing to come from Madison. It contained a heartfelt letter about missing him, wanting to help, and instructions to expect a special delivery. Enclosed was a detailed plan to smuggle drugs into the prison via a corrupt guard, complete with names, dates, and payment schedules. The plan was entirely fictional, but it looked real. And when prison officials intercepted the package during a random inspection, my father couldn't explain it. He claimed he had nothing to do with it, but the letter referenced private conversations he'd had with Madison during prison visits. I knew the details because I'd hired someone to sit nearby during visiting hours and record everything. The prison's internal investigation concluded that my father had been attempting to establish a drug pipeline. He was placed in solitary confinement, lost all privileges, and gained an additional disciplinary sentence. His chance of parole became virtually non-existent. Madison was the last, and I saved my most creative work for her. She'd been writing a blog from prison, using a friend on the outside to post her entries. The blog portrayed her as a survivor, a young woman who'd made a terrible mistake and was working to redeem herself. She blamed the fire, the trauma, the medication. She never took real responsibility. The blog gained a following. People sent her supportive messages. A literary agent even reached out about a potential book deal upon her release. Madison was turning her attempted participation in my murder into a career opportunity. I spent weeks reading every post, every comment, every interview request she'd accepted through her proxy. She'd crafted a narrative where she was the victim of circumstances, of a justice system that didn't understand trauma, of a sister who wouldn't forgive a moment of weakness. She never mentioned the years of bullying, the cruelty, the systematic way she'd made my childhood miserable. One blog post particularly enraged me. Madison described a memory of us as children, playing in the backyard, laughing together. She wrote about how much she missed her sister, how she wished we could reconcile, how she hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive her. The comments section overflowed with sympathy, with people calling me heartless for not reaching out to her. What Madison didn't mention was that the memory she described had never happened. I'd been 7 years old, playing alone in the backyard while Madison had a birthday party inside with 20 friends. I remembered it vividly because Madison had come outside specifically to tell me I wasn't allowed to join them, that the party was for real people, not space wasters like me. She'd laughed when I cried. That's when I knew I had to act more decisively. Madison was rewriting history, and people were believing her version. She was setting herself up for a redemption arc that would erase all accountability. I reached out to a journalist named Marcus Webb who'd covered the trial extensively. Marcus had been one of the few reporters who'd questioned the defense's narrative, who'd dug into the evidence and presented the facts clearly. I trusted him to handle what I was about to give him. We met at a quiet restaurant in downtown Cleveland. I brought copies of everything, Childhood journals where I'd documented Madison's bullying, school records showing Madison's pattern of blaming me for things she'd done, testimony from teachers and neighbors about the family dynamics, and most importantly, the unedited hospital footage with enhanced audio. Marcus reviewed the materials over several meetings. He was thorough, fact-checking every claim, verifying every document. Then he wrote a comprehensive investigative piece for a major online publication, titled The Sister Who Wasn't Saved, The Untold Story Behind a Viral Prison Blog. The article demolished Madison's narrative piece by piece, using her own words from the blog alongside evidence of what had actually happened. Marcus interviewed Dr. Chen, nurses from the ICU, my therapist, with my permission, and even tracked down former classmates who remembered Madison's behavior toward me. The article went viral within hours of publication. Madison's blog comments section transformed from supportive to hostile overnight. People felt betrayed, manipulated, used. The literary agent not only withdrew the book offer but released a statement condemning Madison's attempt to profit from attempted murder. I couldn't allow that. I created my own blog, anonymous and carefully worded to avoid any legal issues. I called it The Other Side of the Story. I posted court transcripts, medical records with my information redacted, expert testimonies about what my injuries indicated about the fire, and timeline analyses that destroyed Madison's version of events. I dissected every lie she'd told. Every manipulation. Every time she'd blamed me for something she did. I posted childhood photos with captions explaining the context, Madison's expensive birthday parties next to my simple ones, her designer clothes next to my thrift store outfits, her new laptop next to my used one. I never revealed my identity, but I made it clear I was someone with intimate knowledge of the case. The blog went viral. News outlets picked it up. Madison's narrative collapsed under the weight of documented evidence. The literary agent withdrew the book offer. Madison's blog followers turned on her, flooding her posts with accusations and disgust. The friend who'd been posting for her shut down the blog entirely. Madison lost her platform and her future career as a sympathetic survivor. But I wasn't done. I knew Madison's weakness. She'd always been obsessed with her appearance and her social standing. In prison, she'd been maintaining relationships with her old friends, girls who visited her, sent her photos of their lives, kept her connected to the world she'd lost. I targeted those friendships systematically. Using my fake social media profiles, I befriended Madison's friends. I went to the same bars they frequented, joined the same gym, attended the same yoga classes. I became part of their social circle without them knowing who I really was. Over time, I planted seeds of doubt. Casual mentions of how Madison had always been manipulative. Questions about whether they'd ever noticed how she treated her sister. Stories about mutual acquaintances who'd been burned by Madison's lies. I never pushed too hard, never made it obvious. Within a year, Madison's friendships had withered. The visits stopped. The letters became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Her friends hadn't explicitly rejected her, they'd simply drifted away, found new priorities, got busy with their lives. Madison was left alone with nothing but time to think about what she'd done. Her letters to me, forwarded through my lawyer, became increasingly unhinged. She knew someone was systematically dismantling her life, but she couldn't prove who or how. She accused me, of course, but I'd been careful. Everything I'd done was either legal or completely untraceable. "You're destroying me," she wrote in one letter. "Why can't you just let it go?" "I made a mistake. I'm sorry." I didn't respond. An apology from someone who'd smiled while encouraging our father to murder me wasn't worth the paper it was written on. The years passed. I continued therapy, worked through my trauma, and built a life I was proud of. I got promoted at work, eventually leaving the small firm to join a prestigious accounting company in Cleveland. I dated, had relationships, made friends who became my chosen family. I bought a house, adopted 2 rescue dogs, and discovered I was good at pottery. But every few months, I'd check in on my family's status. I'd review Uncle Raymond's prison records, noting violations that kept pushing back his release date. I'd monitor my mother's declining mental state through reports from her prison psychologist that I obtained through carefully worded Freedom of Information requests. I'd track my father's movements through the prison system as he was transferred from facility to facility, always somehow ending up in situations that made his life harder. And I'd read Madison's letters, watching her handwriting deteriorate, her thoughts become more scattered, her grip on reality loosen as the isolation and consequences caught up with her. The justice system had given them prison sentences. I gave them something more permanent, the destruction of any chance they had at rebuilding their lives after release. Uncle Raymond would leave prison penniless and elderly, with a federal fraud conviction making him unemployable. My mother would emerge broken, with no support system and a reputation that preceded her everywhere. My father would stay locked up for the maximum sentence, and even if he eventually got out, he'd be old, alone, and marked as someone who tried to murder his own daughter. Madison would serve her time and emerge to a world where everyone knew what she'd done, where no employer would hire her, where no friend would trust her, where the future she'd envisioned was permanently closed. They thought they could erase me. Instead, I erased them. On the 3-year anniversary of the fire, I drove to the lot where our old house had stood. The property had been sold, and a new house was under construction. I stood on the sidewalk, looking at the fresh foundation, the framing that was going up, the promise of something new being built from ashes. My phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Mitchell, my therapist, reminding me of our session tomorrow. Another text from my boyfriend, asking if I wanted to grab dinner. A third from my friend Jessica, sharing a funny video. I had a life. I had people who cared about me. I had proven that I was worth more than they'd ever believed. The fire had taken our house, nearly taken my life, and revealed the truth about my family. But I'd survived. I'd healed. And I'd made sure that the people who tried to dispose of me faced consequences that extended far beyond prison walls. Some people might call what I did revenge. I call it justice. The kind that doesn't end when the prison doors close, but follows you, day after day, year after year, reminding you that actions have consequences and that some betrayals can never be forgiven. I sleep peacefully now, better than I ever did in that house where I was never wanted. And somewhere, in their separate cells, my parents, sister, and uncle lie awake, thinking about the daughter, sister, and niece they tried to kill. The one who survived and made sure they'd never have peace again. They wanted me to disappear. Instead, I became their ghost, haunting every moment of their ruined lives. And I'm not finished yet. Madison gets out in 5 years. My father might get out in 12 if his parole is denied repeatedly, which I'll work to ensure. My mother has 9 years left, and Uncle Raymond has at least 14 more years after his consecutive sentences. I have plenty of time to plan what comes next. Because the fire may have ended that night, but what they started in that hospital room is far from over. They taught me that family means nothing. That love is conditional. That some children are worth more than others. I learned the lesson well. And I'm going to spend the rest of their lives making sure they remember it too.